Picture this. A person walks through life, seemingly intact. Yet beneath the surface, their body holds echoes of a past they can no longer recall. Their heart races at the sound of a slamming door. Their muscles tense at the scent of smoke, even in a safe space. These are not mere quirks of personality or irrational fears. They are the fingerprints of trauma, imprinted not just in the mind, but in the very fabric of the body. What if the body remembered what the mind tried to forget? What if every unspoken terror, every unresolved scream, left a physiological scar, shaping the way we move, breathe, and exist in the world? This is the unsettling truth that Bessel van der Kolk uncovered in his decades of research. Trauma is not just a psychological wound. It is a physiological one, etched into our nervous system, our muscles, our breath. We tend to think of memory as something stored in the brain, neatly categorized in the vaults of cognition. But trauma operates differently. It bypasses the logical centers of the mind and embeds itself in the body's survival mechanisms. When a person experiences a traumatic event, their brain's rational processing centers shut down and the body takes over, reacting in ways designed to ensure survival. The problem arises when the threat has long passed, yet the body remains in a state of perpetual alertness, unable to distinguish past danger from present safety. This is why survivors of trauma may experience panic attacks without an identifiable trigger, why they may feel numbness in parts of their body, why their sleep is fractured by nightmares they cannot articulate. The body, in its desperate attempt to protect them, keeps replaying the past, even when the mind has tried to move on. Consider the case of James, a former firefighter who spent decades pulling people from burning buildings. He never considered himself traumatized until he began waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding as if he were still inside a collapsing structure. He had no conscious memory of specific events triggering these episodes, yet his body knew. His nervous system, conditioned to respond to life-threatening situations, had never fully reset. His story is not unique. Across the world, millions carry the invisible weight of trauma in their bodies, mistaking their symptoms for weakness, for failure, for something broken within them. But this is not weakness. This is biology. This is the body's way of screaming when the mind has gone silent. The human body is an archive, storing memories not in words but in sensations, reflexes, and automatic responses. When trauma strikes, it hijacks the brain's usual pathways, embedding itself deep within the nervous system. This process begins in the amygdala, the brain's emotional sentinel, which triggers the fight or flight response when danger looms. Simultaneously, the hippocampus, responsible for organizing and contextualizing memories, becomes impaired, leaving traumatic experiences fragmented and disoriented in the mind. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational thought, often shuts down entirely during extreme stress, stripping a person of their ability to think clearly or articulate what is happening. As a result, the body becomes the primary repository of trauma, recording the event not as a coherent memory, but as a visceral, embodied experience. This biological reality explains why trauma survivors often struggle to verbalize their suffering. The memories are not stored in the language centers of the brain, but in the nervous system, manifesting as physical sensations, tightness in the chest, tremors, chronic pain, or an overwhelming sense of dread. Consider James, the firefighter whose body continued to react to phantom flames even when he was miles away from any fire. His nervous system had been conditioned to perceive danger where there was none, a consequence of prolonged exposure to life-threatening situations. His body had learned to survive, but in doing so, it had also learned to fear long after the threat had passed. His panic attacks were not irrational. They were the body's misguided attempt to protect him from a danger that no longer existed. Studies have shown that trauma alters neural pathways, particularly in regions responsible for emotion regulation and self-awareness. The insula, which processes bodily sensations, becomes hyperactive in trauma survivors, heightening their awareness of internal distress while impairing their ability to regulate it. This explains why many trauma survivors report feeling disconnected from themselves, as if they are living in a body that no longer belongs to them, Additionally, the autonomic nervous system, which governs involuntary functions like heart rate and breathing, becomes dysregulated. Trauma survivors may experience chronic hypervigilance, where their bodies remain locked in a perpetual state of alertness, or conversely, dissociation, where they feel numb and detached from reality. These physiological changes are not a matter of weakness or failure of willpower. They are the body's survival mechanisms, designed to protect an individual in moments of extreme danger. However, when these mechanisms become chronic, they transform from adaptive responses into lifelong burdens. Trauma does not simply reside in the mind, it lives in the body, shaping how a person moves, breathes, and interacts with the world. Understanding this biological reality is the first step toward healing, as it reframes trauma not as a personal failing, but as a physiological wound, one that can be repaired, not with words alone, but through the body's own capacity for recovery. Trauma does not discriminate, but its effects are not experienced uniformly. Age, gender, and race shape the way individuals endure and process traumatic experiences, influencing both the intensity of their suffering and their access to healing. Children, for instance, are especially vulnerable to the long-term consequences of trauma because their brains and bodies are still developing. When a child is subjected to chronic abuse, neglect, or violence, their nervous system becomes conditioned to perceive the world as a place of constant danger. Unlike adults, who may have a more developed sense of self and resilience, children lack the cognitive tools to make sense of their suffering. This often leads to deep-seated physiological and psychological disruptions that can last a lifetime. Consider the case of Amina, a 10-year-old girl growing up in a household where domestic violence was a near nightly occurrence. Her father, struggling with untreated trauma from his own childhood, would erupt into violent outbursts, sending Amina and her mother scrambling for safety. Over time, Amina's brain adapted to this environment by remaining in a state of hyperarousal, her body constantly braced for danger. Even after she was removed from the home and placed in foster care, her nervous system remained on high alert, making it difficult for her to form secure attachments or regulate her emotions. Studies show that children exposed to chronic trauma experience changes in brain structure, particularly in regions responsible for emotional regulation and impulse control. Their bodies do not simply store memories of fear, they become biologically wired to expect threat, shaping their behavior well into adulthood. Gender further complicates the experience of trauma, as societal expectations and systemic inequalities influence both the nature of the trauma and the way it is received. Women and girls are disproportionately affected by sexual violence and domestic abuse, yet they often face greater barriers to recognition and treatment. Societal stigma, victim blaming, and institutional failures mean that many women internalize their trauma rather than seek help. Take Maria, a woman in her early 30s who survived a violent sexual assault in college. In the years that followed, she struggled with panic attacks, chronic pain, and an overwhelming sense of shame. When she sought medical help, she was frequently dismissed, told that her symptoms were all in her head, or prescribed medication without meaningful therapy. Unlike men, who are often encouraged to seek help for PTSD, particularly in military or first responder communities, women's trauma is frequently misdiagnosed or minimized, reinforcing the idea that their suffering is less urgent or less real. Race adds another dimension to this equation, as historical and systemic oppression compounds the trauma experienced by marginalized communities. The legacy of slavery, segregation, and ongoing racial discrimination has created a unique burden for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, whose bodies have been historically targeted by violence and systemic neglect. Trauma is not only personal, but intergenerational, passed down through epigenetic changes and cultural memory. Elijah, a 17-year-old Black teenager, grew up in a neighborhood where police brutality was an ever-present threat. He had witnessed friends being arrested without cause, seen his uncle brutalized during a traffic stop, and lived in constant fear that he too could be next. His trauma was not just the result of a single event, but a cumulative experience of systemic injustice. Unlike white trauma survivors, whose symptoms are often framed as medical conditions requiring treatment, Elijah's hypervigilance and anxiety were frequently misinterpreted as aggression or defiance, leading to disciplinary action rather than support. These stories illustrate that trauma is not a universal experience. It is shaped by the body one inhabits, the society they navigate, and the history they inherit. Understanding these disparities is essential for developing effective interventions, as healing must account for the complex interplay of biology, identity, and environment. If trauma is stored in the body, then healing must begin there. Traditional talk therapy, while valuable, often falls short in addressing the deep physiological imprints of trauma, which reside beyond the reach of language. The body, however, has its own wisdom, a capacity to heal when given the right tools. Practices such as movement, creativity, and connection offer pathways to restore balance, allowing survivors to reclaim their bodies and rewrite their nervous system's response to past pain. These methods do not erase trauma, but they rewire the body's relationship to it, transforming frozen fear into fluid resilience. Movement, in particular, plays a crucial role in this process. The body's natural response to trauma is to freeze, flee, or fight. Yet when these responses are thwarted, the energy becomes trapped, manifesting as chronic tension, pain, or dissociation. Physical movement helps discharge this trapped energy, restoring the body's sense of agency and control. Take the case of Elena, a survivor of childhood abuse who spent years battling chronic fatigue and muscle tension. Traditional therapy helped her understand her trauma intellectually, but it was only when she began practicing dance therapy that she felt a shift. Under the guidance of a therapist, she learned to move with intention, using rhythmic movement to reconnect with her body. As she danced, she began to feel the places where she had been numb, allowing herself to tremble, collapse, and rise again. This process did not erase her trauma, but it allowed her to move through it, rather than remain locked in its grip. Creativity offers another powerful avenue for healing. Trauma disrupts the brain's ability to process experiences coherently, leaving survivors with fragmented, nonverbal memories. Engaging in artistic expression, whether through painting, music, or writing, allows individuals to externalize these internal experiences, giving shape to what words often fail to capture. Consider Amir, a war veteran who struggled with intrusive memories and nightmares. Traditional counseling left him feeling stuck, unable to articulate the horrors he had witnessed. It was only when he joined a creative arts therapy group that he found a way to express himself. Through painting, he recreated scenes from his past, not as literal depictions, but as abstract bursts of color and motion. The act of creation became a form of reclamation, allowing him to process his trauma in a way that felt safe and empowering. Beyond individual practices, connection remains one of the most potent forces in healing. Trauma isolates, severing the bonds that tether us to others. But community-based interventions can restore that sense of belonging. Drumming circles, group yoga, and theater programs have all been used successfully in trauma recovery, emphasizing rhythm, synchronization, and shared presence. When people move, breathe, or create together, they rewire their nervous systems, reinforcing the message that they are not alone. This is not just psychological comfort, it is physiological repair. The body learns once again that safety is not an illusion, that healing is possible, and that the past does not have to dictate the future. Despite the profound understanding of trauma's physiological and psychological impacts, society continues to neglect its victims, perpetuating cycles of suffering rather than fostering recovery. This failure is not accidental. It is rooted in historical patterns of denial, systemic inequality, and a cultural aversion to confronting pain. From the earliest days of psychiatry to modern mental health policies, trauma has been misunderstood, dismissed, or outright ignored, leaving countless individuals to suffer in silence. The consequences of this neglect are devastating. Untreated trauma manifests as chronic illness, substance abuse, violence, and intergenerational suffering, reinforcing a cycle that benefits neither individuals nor communities. Historically, society has treated trauma as a personal failing rather than a collective responsibility. During World War I, soldiers suffering from shell shock were often labeled as cowards, punished rather than treated. Medical professionals struggled to understand their symptoms, tremors, nightmares, panic attacks, because they did not fit within the prevailing models of injury. It was not until the Vietnam War that post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, was formally recognized, and even then, many returning veterans were met with stigma rather than support. The failure to acknowledge trauma as a legitimate condition led to widespread suffering, with veterans often turning to drugs or violence as a way to cope with their fragmented nervous systems. This pattern persists today, as mental health services remain underfunded and trauma survivors are frequently criminalized rather than treated. The consequences of this neglect extend far beyond individual suffering. They shape entire communities. Trauma is not evenly distributed. It disproportionately affects marginalized populations, including low-income families, people of color, and those living in environments plagued by systemic violence. Consider the case of Elijah, the black teenager whose body remained in a state of hypervigilance due to the constant threat of police brutality. His symptoms, restlessness, irritability, difficulty concentrating, are textbook signs of trauma, yet he is more likely to be disciplined in school or arrested than referred to therapy. The criminal justice system, rather than the mental health system, becomes his point of contact, reinforcing a cycle of trauma and punishment. This is not an isolated incident. It is a systemic failure that disproportionately targets Black and brown communities, where trauma is often met with incarceration rather than healing. Beyond the individual level, trauma also erodes the fabric of society itself. Communities that have endured generations of violence, poverty, and displacement carry the collective weight of unprocessed pain. Historical trauma, such as the legacy of slavery, colonization, and forced assimilation, continues to shape the lived experiences of entire populations, influencing everything from health outcomes to economic stability. Studies have shown that chronic stress and trauma can be passed down epigenetically, affecting future generations through changes in gene expression. This means that the wounds of the past are not just remembered, they are biologically inherited, perpetuating cycles of suffering across time. Despite this knowledge, society continues to prioritize punitive measures over healing. Mental health care remains inaccessible to many, with insurance coverage limited and waiting lists for trauma specialists often stretching for months. Schools, rather than implementing trauma-informed approaches, rely on punitive discipline models that further alienate traumatized students. The healthcare system, instead of treating trauma as a physiological condition, often reduces it to a psychiatric diagnosis, focusing on symptom management rather than true recovery. Until society shifts its perspective, until it recognizes that trauma is not an individual problem, but a collective wound, we will continue to fail those who need healing the most. Healing from trauma is not about erasing the past, but about reclaiming the present. It is about restoring a sense of agency, of knowing that one is not trapped in the grip of an unchangeable fate. For many trauma survivors, the defining feature of their suffering is a loss of control. The feeling that their bodies are not truly their own, that they are at the mercy of unseen forces. This is why the path to recovery must include a return to self-determination, a reawakening of the body's capacity to make choices, to feel safe, and to move forward with intention. The body, once a prison of fear, can become a vessel of resilience. Consider the case of Maya, a woman who spent years in an abusive relationship where she was subjected to constant fear, manipulation, and physical harm. After escaping, she struggled with panic attacks, insomnia, and a deep sense of disconnection from her own body. Traditional therapy helped her understand the psychological roots of her trauma, but it was only when she began engaging in somatic therapy, practices that emphasize body awareness and movement, that she began to feel a shift. Through guided exercises, she learned to notice the sensations in her body without judgment, to recognize when she was tensing her shoulders in response to stress, to breathe deeply when anxiety surged. Over time, she discovered that she could choose how to respond to these sensations rather than being overwhelmed by them. She was no longer a prisoner of her nervous system's automatic reactions. She was an active participant in her own healing. Agency is not simply about making choices. It is about reclaiming the right to make choices, Trauma often strips individuals of this right, conditioning their bodies to react with fear rather than respond with intention. But through consistent, mindful engagement with the body, survivors can rewire these responses. Practices such as yoga, tai chi, and mindfulness meditation help individuals develop a sense of grounding, reinforcing the message that they are safe in the present moment. These practices do not erase the past, but they offer a way to live fully in the now, free from the constant intrusion of old wounds. The journey toward healing is not linear, nor is it easy. There will be setbacks, moments of doubt, and echoes of old fears. But with each step forward, each breath taken with intention, each movement made with purpose, the body remembers its own strength. Trauma may have left its mark, but it does not have to define the future. The body, in all its complexity, carries within it the capacity for resilience, for renewal, for transformation, and when given the right tools, it can lead the way toward a life reclaimed.
Thank you for watching this video. I hope it was insightful and educative. If you like this video, do well to click like, share, and subscribe for more insightful videos like this. See you later. Bye.